To discuss the world's number one economic topic right now, inflation, Christoph Schumacher joins us for this week's Economy Matters. So, Christoph, you're looking at this consumption basket.
Yes. I thought since I'd already covered what causes inflation, another big issue is how do we actually measure inflation? I think there's always a bit confusion because I get asked, people go, oh, inflation, now what is that consumption basket and what's the difference between a CPI and inflation? So I thought it might be actually quite valuable to understand not just what causes inflation, but also how do we actually measure inflation?
And what have you concluded?
It is a rather complex process. Sort of imagine you go to the supermarket, and not just the supermarket, but all the other things you buy on a very regular basis. You put them in the basket, then you go to the checkout, and then they tell you how much all those goods in that basket cost. And then some time later, you do exactly the same thing, buying exactly the same items. And the change in price, this is what we call inflation. And the actual value of those goods in that basket is what we call the consumer price index, often simply referred to as CPI.
Is it an exact science?
Not quite, but it is quite a complex process, and give some credit to States New Zealand because they put currently 649 items into the basket. And then each item gets a weight depending on how often we buy this good. And they need to permanently update this. So they take items out, they put items in. So surprise, surprise, in the last review, we put in e-cigarettes, cartridges, more sports equipment, these kind of things. And we took things out we don't really use anymore, like CDs, hard copy CDs, or entertainment systems, stereo systems, uh, telephones, like normal landline phones. These things get taken out, new things get put in. And once they decide which items go into the basket, then they need to decide what kind of weight do we give those items, because all of them together add up to 100 units. So we need to figure out which items do we buy more, which items do we buy less. And all of this together is repeated every quarter to produce a new CPI value.
So, can we accurately compare New Zealand's inflation rate with other countries then?
We often do, but the tricky part, of course, is each country assigns different weights and assigns different items that go into this basket. So while we always try to capture what people consume, the weights, for example, placed in Australia will be different to the weights placed in New Zealand, and the items put into the basket will be different. And quite important to notice how that has an impact on inflation. We, for example, start screaming, oh, inflation sits at 8%. But for example, petrol has a very high weight in that basket. So a change in petrol prices has a huge impact on the actual inflation rate. For example, petrol has fallen by about 11%. If the weight of petrol was smaller in the basket, our inflation rate might be quite different. So that needs to be taken into account, that different items have different impacts on changes, and we can't quite easily compare them across countries because they capture different products with different weights.
But what we do know, though, and uniformed right across the world, is that inflation is out of control.
Absolutely right. And I mean, that was a slightly shocking news again, because up to the announcement of the Q4 in 2022, the expectation was inflation would fall. All the banks had forecasted it'll fall. The government had said it's falling, and it didn't. It remained at 7.2%, so it's stagnating. We haven't quite reached the height yet and are on the falling path. And if you compare inflation to our previous quarter from Q4 to Q3, it actually has increased by 1.4%. So we haven't got a lid on inflation in New Zealand yet, and certainly not globally, where some European countries and other big powerful nations are hitting for double digits. So now we haven't quite got control of inflation yet.
In terms of the quarterly non-tradables inflation, though, the government's come out and said that that looks to have peaked and that will be slowly trending downwards.
Yes, we are expecting that part, the non-tradable part, to be falling, but we haven't quite seen it yet. I mean, the next announcement for the next values will bring more clarity about this, but hey, we've heard a few times that we have peaked with inflation and it hasn't quite happened as yet. And things such as the recent flood in Auckland doesn't help because adds more pressure to an economy. There will be a lot of claims being made, repairs being done. All this will eventually drive prices up even more. So it's these unexpected events also that throw a spanner in the works and are not helping for inflation to fall.
And also, a part to play in this is every quarter that basket may lose items and gain items. So that adds a little complicated element to the figure.
Yes, it does. Statistics New Zealand tries to keep the basket very constant. The last review was about 2 years ago. So they try to keep it constant just to make it comparable between years. But yes, they do regularly update these and collect these values. So it is a pretty accurate value, but it's a complex process as well. And maybe people don't quite appreciate what goes into this little figure that we hear. We all feel the impact, but don't often know what's happening under the hood.
So, can you comfortably say that inflation will nudge lower this year?
No, I don't think anyone can. We all hope for. I think we're on the right track. Salaries are still slightly pushing up, but with the borders opening more, and our new prime minister said that he'll try to do something about the labor shortage, maybe bringing in more people, processing visas, work visas quicker. All these are steps in the right direction. So I think we will see inflation falling in 2023.
And is the Reserve Bank's monetary policy having the desired effect?
That's always very tricky to judge. These things take a while to actually filter through, and there's caution at plays as well. I mean, we would, as an economist, I would like to see the OCR rising even further, but there are whole social implications of it because people are already struggling making their mortgage payments. Prices are going up. A higher OCR will put more pressure on households and people will struggle to stay in houses. So that's a very important issue that needs to be taken into account. So I think we see some impact, but it always takes time to trickle through, and we'll see what will happen when the next OCR announcement comes.
Christoph Schumacher, thanks for your time.
Oh, you're most welcome.